First of all, it's an extraordinary pleasure to have such a full crowd. My name is Stephen Erlanger. I'm the London bureau chief of the New York Times, and we are co-sponsoring this with Chatham House. Just to say a few obvious technical things, this is Chatham House, but these are not Chatham House rules. This is on the record, it's being live streamed, so be careful what you say, if you care. You can follow it or comment on Twitter at hashtag AskChiNYT, presumably that's Chatham House INYT. And if you could, I know it's like the movies, but if you could put your phones at least on silent, that would be much appreciated. So we don't have tons of time, and we have 5 speakers who are, I think, a very good cross-section of opinion in this extraordinary drama that we have going on. We have an Iraq that seemed to be cracking. We have this new group, ISIS, which perhaps was a tragedy foretold, but for many seems to have come out of nowhere. You have Britain about to vote tomorrow in Parliament to bomb alongside the French and the Americans inside Iraq only, lucky Iraq. But Syria is part of the equation, Iran is part of the equation, perhaps even Afghanistan, which NATO is leaving at the end of the year, don't forget, is part of the equation. The Americans have been trying to put together a broad-based Iraqi government that will include, they hope, the Kurds. For the first time really since 2010, will that government work? Will it survive? Will Iraq survive? So what else should the West do? So these are the big questions. We have Dr. Ali Alawi, who is, had been in the Iraqi government for a long time, was Minister of Finance, Minister of Defense. He had gone to MIT and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Dr. Abbas Khadim is at SAIS in Washington. He has been a scholar in America. He was an assistant professor of national security affairs at Monterey. He has also was at the Iraqi embassy in Washington and has written some histories on Iraq. Dr. Anas Al-Tikriti is the founder and CEO of the Cordoba Foundation. He has done research, he's done hostage negotiations, and his expertise basically is political Islamic thought and extremism. And to my right, Bayan Sami Abdurrahman, who was a journalist in a failed part of her life, probably. Or a successful part. And Bayan lives in London. She is the regional government high representative to the United Kingdom from the Kurdish government and represents them here. And at the far end, Ali Khederi is now chief executive of a Dubai-based risk analysis firm called Dragamon Partners. He'd been working with Exxon, but he also served in Iraq as special assistant to 5 American ambassadors. He's an Iraqi American, so that's our panel. I think I'm going to ask Dr. Alawi to start. I'm asking people to have 5 to 7 minutes, which I'll be fairly strict about, because I do want you to have a chance to ask questions as you please. So please, sir. Dr. Alawi, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's hard to encapsulate this epical crisis, I think, in 5 minutes, but I'll try. This, to me, is the worst crisis that Iraq has faced since its inception, because it is actually the first time where the integrity of the state as a unified whole has been seriously questioned. And not only by what happened since June after the incursions of ISIS into the northwest of the country, but also because there has been a fundamental inability to fashion a vision of the country in which all groups share. And this has been a perennial problem since the founding of the Iraqi state. In one way or another, these issues were either ignored, transcended, or perhaps subsumed under different headings, depending on the epoch that we're talking about. But since 2003, all of these issues came out to the fore. And now they have been crystallized in this terrible condition in which the state finds itself. Nearly a third of the country is occupied by a group that seems to have a fundamentally different idea of what a state means. Their idea of a dawla is structurally different from that of the nation state. So we have one issue that's now coming up to the fore, which is in some ways a global issue. That is whether the nation state can exist in its form that has emerged out of the Treaty of Westphalia, or at least in the Middle East since the end of World War I. We have another issue which is looming and still unresolved. You can trace that issue perhaps back to the end of the Ottoman Empire, which is the drive, as it were, of the Kurdish people for a state that reflects their national and ethnic aspirations and cultural aspirations. Whether this could be fulfilled in the context of a unified Iraqi state is now seriously being questioned. The third aspect of the crisis is perhaps the most deep, I would say, in the sense that the largest component of Iraq is in fact the Arab population, but the Arab population of Iraq is divided. The divisions in the past may have been defined in sectarian terms. That is, a certain vision of the state or a certain vision of the state and society articulated by one or the other of the major sectarian groups in Iraq. Now it has taken on a different shape. There's now a structural rejection of the other that goes way beyond sectarianism. And here I'm talking about a fundamental shift in the nature in which the sectarian conflict has been set in Iraq. Before, it may have been an issue of power and privilege and patronage. Now it has become an issue of demonizing the other. And this has stretched into other countries of the Middle East. This has become a fundamental aspect of the crisis in Syria. It's a fundamental aspect of the crisis in Lebanon, also further afield in Yemen and Bahrain. So all of these now are being played out against a background of intense violence and of very, very serious socioeconomic and environmental degradation of the conditions in the Middle East. And here I'm talking about the non-Gulf countries. Looking at the Middle East from the prism of the Gulf, you get an entirely different idea and perspective of what it is. In the Middle East itself, that is the heartlands, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan to some extent, and Egypt. You have a very, very serious socioeconomic and environmental crisis that is now looming and also is beginning to affect the political climate, which goes beyond, as I said, just sectarianism, ethno-sectarian divisions, and the drive for nation states on the part of the Kurds, and the drive for a fundamentally different political structure that is encapsulated by the ISIS incursion. How are we going to come out of this crisis? I don't think it is not possible the way it's being framed right now. It's not possible through increasing US and other countries' involvement in the war by bombing selective targets, because there is a contradiction built into these policies. And these contradictions are, it's a highly nuanced and a highly delicate path that they have chosen, supporting one group in one country ostensibly because they are friends, while in another country they seem to be enemies. Allying yourself with one faction, hoping that other factions that are close to it are somehow quarantined and pushed aside. This will get, I think, the Western alliance into a real twist in trying to define who is their enemy and who is their friend, who are their short-term allies and who are their long-term allies. And the sustaining of this bombing campaign, which is seen to be part of the campaign against or reversing the ISIS advances, in my mind, will not succeed because it ignores fundamental issues of who are the real players on the ground, who are the actors who need to be strengthened, and who are the actors that need to be buttressed. Above all, there is no theme there's no overarching vision as to how the Middle East should be restructured and reordered, given the huge array of issues that have emerged out of World War I and 100 years later have not been resolved. Any patchwork attempt to resolve this, I think, is going to be, will end in an abysmal failure. There are many reasons why we have come to this terrible impasse. You can start from the occupation, which was incoherent, poorly led, poorly governed, to the political class that emerged in Iraq to run the country from 2004 onwards, the huge issues that we have with really a dysfunctional political class. We have a state machinery that is nowhere near being capable of running a modern state. And we have superimposed on that a security force that collapsed within a matter of hours after billions, literally billions of dollars that have been expended on it, not only by the United States in the early days, but also by Iraq. These are serious questions that have remained unanswered and cannot be answered simply by expanding a bombing campaign against selective targets, hoping that certain groups will benefit while other groups will be diminished.
You said you felt that some groups needed to be strengthened. Could you just briefly describe who some of those are, and then we'll go to the next speaker?
Well, in the case of Iraq, what is happening is that the central government itself has an armed force that is incapable of meeting the requirements of retaking back all the territory that has been lost. So it is imperative that we stand up at least 2, possibly 3 divisions that are of professional standards that can meet the task. At the same time, we have to admit to ourselves that there are some, in certain quarters, seem to be unsavory groups that are holding the line now against ISIS, particularly northeast of Baghdad and North Baghdad. These groups are, one way or another, structurally different from the groups that the United States wants to support. These are militias that have a sectarian orientation and that are connected one way or another with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. These people are holding the front. Now, whether the United States is going to bomb these groups or not, while at the same time hoping that somehow these forces will not be strengthened, I don't know how this will work out. And in the case of Syria also, which is an extension of the Iraqi campaign, how can you differentiate in such fine terms between ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, Ansar al-Sham, and all the other myriad jihadi groups that draw their inspiration one way or another from a version of Islam that seems to be vindicating or accepting this kind of violence? Now, we might claim that ISIS is the most extreme of the extremes, but they're all part of one particular way of looking at the world. And how do you differentiate between what is good and what is not so good?
Yes, that's
a serious problem.
That's a solid question, but let's leave it for a bit later. Dr. Khadim, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the New York Times International and certainly our host, Chatham House. It's an honor to be here. Can Iraq survive? I decided to go by the question and go from there, again, to help my friend Dr. Dr. Ali Allawi, the good Allawi, to solve this whole problem. Is it going to survive? I think Iraq will survive one way or another. Iraq has survived epidemics, natural disasters for thousands of years of bad politicians. It will survive this time, and definitely ISIS is no different than the other groups that have been committing the same kind of crimes and murder in the past, from the Khawarij to the Wahhabi invasion in the 1800s and all the way to the 20th century. So we do have more than what we see right now, and Iraq survived it. I think the quintessential problem or question that should follow that is what we mean by Iraq that will survive. If we are talking about Iraq the way the map is structured now, that would be a legitimate question. But I think there is a situation right now where we will have to sit and the Iraqis have to sit basically and ask themselves this hard question: do they want to be calling Iraq and keeping the same map, or do they want to have an Iraq with different kind of boundaries. There are three components, major components in Iraq that don't seem until now to figure a way to get together and live together and coexist. The Kurds in the north, the Sunni Arabs in the center and west of Iraq, and the Shia in the south. And the Kurds, it all goes back to our question of, do we really have an Iraqi identity that we all want to embrace, and we all call ourselves Iraqis? And what do we mean by us being Iraqis? The Kurds are exercising a certain right, inalienable right, actually, for any group of people. We just had a referendum in this country a few days ago to see if they can fulfill their nationalist aspirations, if they cannot bring themselves to calling themselves Iraqis and want to be Iraqis, and if they want to be Kurds with a nation and an entity, then so be it. The only thing is, if you are going to do it sometime, do it now, please. So you don't have to, give people more grief and receive more grief from them. Remember, this unity with Iraq has cost the Kurds a lot and also cost the Iraqis a lot. One of the reasons why Iraqi politics is messed up right now is because it has this kind of three-dimensional or three fronts for every politician to fight. So that's a question of the very identity of being an Iraqi. The other question with the Sunni Arabs and the Shia, these are all Arabs, all of them say they are Iraqis, but they mean different things by being Iraqis. The Sunni says, I'm an Iraqi, and believes that he is the only legitimate Iraqi. Not every Sunni. I've seen many, I've talked to many, I went to school in Mosul, but that seems to be the growing attitude for a long time. The Shia, although being an Arab, he is not really acknowledged as full-fledged, legitimate Iraqi or Arab even, not for the Sunnis in Iraq, not for the Arab Sunni world, which is also the extension of the Iraqi Sunnis. And until they would go and believe that these are also Iraqis, and they acknowledge that they exist, that their numbers are what they are, that they are part of this makeup of the country, that will be a problem. For the Shia, same thing. They are looking at themselves as the majority that has been oppressed for, some go to 80 years, some go to 1,400 years. And they think that this is their one time in a 1,400 years chance to right this historic wrong. And the question is, do they really want to be this? I just came back from Iraq and spent 3 weeks there, moving in the Middle Euphrates, Shia land, met people from politicians to top clerics, Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, Grand Ayatollah Hakim, several others in the clerical backgrounds, and also the average man on the street took cabs and sat on cafes. And what you see here, for the first time in my life, I grew up in the same area that I visited. I visited 3 provinces that I frequented a lot in my life. The first time in my life, I see a very weak commitment to a unified Iraq in that place. This is a very disturbing thing for anyone who would like to ask a question and answer it with yes. Will Iraq be Iraq as we knew it? Why is that? Because people gave up, and there are lots of problems, a lot of killing, a lot of sectarianism, a lot of distress and massacres. Remember, the Shia wakes up every morning in Najaf and Karbala, and all they see are the people who are simply driven out of their homes, and now they are living in the schools and in the mosques of Najaf and Karbala, and half of the family has been abducted or kidnapped, and the other were killed, and then with 2, 3, 4 survivors there. That's big. So it's a big problem from the Shia side, and that is a legitimate and deep grievance. The Sunnis, Sunni Arabs have also been caught between the violence that is there, the bombardment that goes on their areas, their corrupt and opportunist politicians who are being elected. Let's remember that 100% of local governance in Salah ad-Din, Mosul, and Anbar is done by elected Sunni politicians. So there is a lot of this. I can only echo what Dr. Ali Alawi just said. Iraq was messed up. Iraq was really ruined by the occupation. It was not served well by even the way the mandates from the UN were fulfilled. The United States left Iraq in 2011 with no military to speak of, no good administration, no functional constitution. They gave Iraq a system they don't even understand. For the first time, an occupier would give a system of governance that is completely different. You know, when the British left all the places they occupied and colonized, they left monarchies behind. The French left republics. The U.S. did completely the opposite. Now, those American advisors did barely understand the American system. Imagine how they went and advised another. No one looks good, whoever was there in that place. Yes, the United States did not introduce corruption to Iraq, but it put it on steroids when it went there.
Kadim?
So I will stop here, and then I would be more than happy to talk more about this in the Q&A.
Fine. I just have one quick question, which will be hard to answer quickly, but I hope you would try. The al-Maliki government failed to hold the loyalties of all Iraqis. I mean, why was that impossible to do? I mean, was it the sense of Shias on top finally, or was there not enough reaching out, or was it simply too internecine?
Well, it's a good question. There's no question that Maliki government failed, and I will tell you that the way things looking now, Dr. Abadi's government is going to fail. It is already failing. There is also the government before that. Let's remember that Ja'fari, who was also a prime minister, he was vetoed and he was kicked out the same way Maliki was kicked out. The problem is not in who, I mean, people up to the swearing in of, or the selection of Dr. Abadi, all what they talked about was the problem is Maliki, remove Maliki, Maliki, Maliki. Now, the moment the guy was sworn in, I mean, let's just take one thing that was the Achilles heel of Maliki, that he kept both the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior. Guess what Abadi is doing now? Not because he likes it, but because this is the best trap to put a prime minister and keep him paralyzed. Don't allow him to put any ministers who are strong, loyal, and people who are good, honest to God people. And that is what's going to happen.
Okay.
The system does not. It's not the man. We need institutionalism in Iraq rather than following on the goodness and the good heart of the politicians.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Altakriti, please.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And thank you to Chatham House and to New York Times for this event. I think that boringly for everyone here, there's going to be a lot of agreement. And I think that the one thing that virtually everyone, I'm not going to preempt what Bayan and Ali are going to speak about, but till now, I think there is an agreement that Iraq has suffered and continues to suffer from gross mismanagement on various levels, whether it be internally, regionally, or even internationally. Iraq has been abused, used for various projects and ideas and interests and the such by internal, by regional, and by international players, to the detriment of Iraq itself. Fascinating how a couple of weeks ago I was involved in a discussion in a think tank that is, let's say, not this particular one, and one which I'm not going to mention to our host here, but we, through 2 hours, in addressing the issue of Iraq, we spoke, I would suggest, no more than 3 minutes about Iraq. And that is the problem. In order to understand Iraq, you needn't actually talk about Iraq, nor about any internal Iraqi players. We talked about Iran, Saudi Arabia, about Jordan, about Turkey. We talked about Europe, about NATO, about the US, about the UK, but very, very little about Iraq itself. And the mismanagement goes beyond the political. I mean, we're talking, the world's, the West, our attention here in the UK, for instance, and in the United States, turns to Iraq every time, let's admit it, every time there is an American or a British or the such who comes at risk or is killed, one way or another. That's when we really start to pay attention to Iraq. In the intermittent period, our attention span with Iraq is extremely low. It's extremely scarce. We don't spend time talking about why it is that for 4 years running, the Mercer Index speaks of Baghdad. Baghdad, you know, to Iraqis, Baghdad is such a beautiful, beautiful thing as being the worst city in the world, bar none, to live in. Why Iraq looms, again, for the 8th year running, at the very bottom of the Transparency International list, one of the most corrupt nations in the world. We don't speak about that, yet we're more than happy to encourage our corporations to go in and to make as much money as possible and the such, at the expense of the fact that the vast majority of the Iraqi people, and I'm not going to talk about Sunnis, Shias, Arabs, or Kurds, the vast majority feel alienated, feel disenfranchised, feel that they do not belong. And I agree with Dr. Abbas, that the problem today, find enough Iraqis to believe in Iraq as it stands, and I think that we will be able to start solving the problem. But we don't. We don't. And therefore, I think that the question that this particular event poses, can Iraq survive? I personally, being an optimistic as I claim to be, I don't think that either Iraq or, in fact, most regional countries will, in the next 2-3 years, have the same borders that we have come to know for the past century. I think that we have entered into a new era, into a new phase, call it the post-Sykes-Picot era, call it an era whereby new power dynamics are going to take place, are going to sort of take, whether it be along ethnic, sectarian, or even mere power interest dynamics. I think that that's going to be the new map. But I want to talk about a couple of points. The first is the issue of ISIS itself. Now, in all the frenzy about ISIS, and I've been one of those who have also been hauled amongst, from one studio to another in order to condemn. And, it's, the cleverest is the person who comes up with the most flowery adjectives about how to describe ISIS. I mean, we've gone through, monstrous and evil, and, we've gone through despicable and all that, and we've run out of adjectives. But the question is, so now what? We've all agreed that they're despicable. We've all agreed, as someone who belongs to the world of Islam, they do not represent Islam or Muslims. But the question is, why not? The question we need to start asking is, why is it that we're now addressing the situation in Iraq as though the whole problem and crisis of Iraq started with the emergence of ISIS, when it actually didn't? Before ISIS, if you remember, there was Al-Qaeda. In 2006, a CIA senior official met with me in a very clandestine fashion in a Zurich hotel, and for 4 hours we discussed Iraq. At the very end, he said, listen, I have only one question. Where can we find Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi? After 4 hours of my voice going hoarse. And I said, well, why are you asking me? And then, if you found him, what will that solve? He said, well, we'll kill him. And I said, and then what? He said, all of the problems will be solved. Now that naivety, and as I said, the mismanagement of the case of Iraq runs up until today. Because, once again, we have politicians, a different government in London, a different government in Washington, yet rehashing the same old tactic for which I came 12 years ago in 2002 to outline why it's a bad idea to go through this particular strategy in freeing Iraq from the clutches of the Ba'athists and Saddam Hussein. Once again, when you obliterate the physical presence of ISIS, and by the way, we were told up until 2 weeks ago they're a ragtag gang of 12 to 15,000 criminals, most of them really not highly trained. How is it that the entire world, 50 countries no less, signing up to a coalition to fight this ragtag element? I mean, it's laughable. It's beyond laughable even. So when we come to the time and we claim victory over this ragtag element, nothing to be really proud of, what do you do with the idea that you have helped disseminate and propagate? Because guess what? We have studied this since the days of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and before that in Afghanistan. These people, how do you fight someone whose ultimate aim is to die? How do you fight someone who actually wishes for nothing more today than for the US and UK to actually bomb Iraq? Simply because that is how they get their clutches into the young, disenfranchised, frustrated, unemployed Iraqis and bring them to their pool. That's what they tell them. They tell them the world hates you. The world has forgotten about you. And with 1 or 2 missiles going wrong, hitting the wrong wedding ceremony or the wrong house, their children, the ones who are left behind, and they come to them saying, do you want to avenge your father? Do you want to avenge your brother? And this is how you do it. So we are basically playing into the hands of these people. You cannot obliterate or annihilate ideas through missiles and guns. Ideas need ideas. And I come here to another element that I want to end with, and that is the regional powers. Because unfortunately, whether we're talking about Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Gulf countries, we're talking about countries who used Iraq to play out their own proxy wars, to play out their conflicts for the past 12 years. None of those, and I can mention a longer list, none of those has actually done anything for Iraq that's been to the betterment and the best interest of Iraq. And one of the things that particular catalogue, that list of regional powers up to Egypt and the such, what they've done that makes us now almost powerless in confronting the danger of ISIS or whoever may come next with the same nihilistic ideology, is the fact that they've obliterated the middle ground through which we can negotiate with the 80 to 85% of disenfranchised youngsters who don't really believe in ISIS or their ideology, but simply have nothing better to do. And they're paying them a wage which for the past 10 years they haven't been receiving. So those middle ground, call it political Islam, call it the Muslim Brotherhood, who've been now criminalized by virtually every single one of those countries, are no longer there in order to negotiate with those youngsters and bring them back from the brink.
Good, thank you. I think you've made the point nicely.
Thank you.
Now, Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman, in July, I think President Barzani said, the time has come to decide our fate, and we should not wait for others to decide it for us. So the Kurds have a moment. Maybe it's right to seize it, maybe it's not. The Americans would prefer that you don't. What do you think? Please.
Well, as I'm sure everybody here knows, and especially this very distinguished panel, every Kurd in their heart wants independence. Nobody asked whether we wanted to be divided among 4 countries. Those 4 countries turned into dictatorships. The Kurds have lived under apartheid, effectively. We've suffered genocide repeatedly. We've suffered chemical bombardment, scorched earth policies, Arabization policies. In all of those countries, we have suffered enormously. So is it any wonder that we want to run our own affairs? However bad we may be at running our own affairs, we will hopefully do better than this. The question you pose is whether now is the moment. Well, it's a very good question, and it goes back to the theme of this evening. Will Iraq survive, or can Iraq survive? Certainly Iraq won't be the Iraq of pre-Mosul, pre-June. If Iraq is to stay within one border, in my view, it needs to be effectively 3 sovereign states within one geographic border. That's the only way we can live together in Iraq. The very distinguished speakers have already explained the reasons for that, how we got to where we are, the fact that even in non-Kurdish parts of Iraq, the commitment to a unified Iraq is weakening. The only way we can live together is effectively to be neighbors with very high fences and a panic alarm, probably. I think that's really the only way. For us to go back to having a centralized form of government is just going to fail. I think one of the big problems we have everywhere in the Middle East, there isn't a concept of win-win. If I'm negotiating with you, I have to win and you have to lose and be defeated and killed and buried alive and killed. That's how, I should have said it that way around. That's how we think in the Middle East. That's one of our the fundamental problems with our character in the Middle East, is we don't believe in win-win. As with regards to the West and the reaction now to ISIS, the recall of Parliament here in London to vote tomorrow on whether to conduct airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq. Well, I hope Parliament will vote the right way. it's quite puzzling why Britain has been holding back. It's a key permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's in NATO. It's a leading member of the EU. It's a global player. Whether the British appreciate that or not, it is a global player with influence. Why is Britain hesitating to use its influence? And how can you think about striking ISIS in Iraq but not Syria? As colleagues here have already said, you can't choose one ally in one country, but the same ally in another country is not your friend. You can't do it like that. ISIS don't recognize these borders, neither should we. Anyway, that's for the debate tomorrow. I want to just use this opportunity just to tell you a little bit about the situation in Kurdistan, which is relevant to the overall theme of whether Iraq can survive. We have 1.4 million Syrian refugees and Iraqi internally displaced people in Kurdistan region. Kurdistan's population is around 5 million. That puts us on a par with Scotland. Imagine Scotland receiving 1.4 million refugees. Even with all the help that Britain would provide, Scotland being an advanced economy, it wouldn't be able to cope. This is what we're dealing with in Kurdistan today. We have people who are traumatized. They have nothing, and I mean nothing. Some of them didn't even have shoes when they arrived in Kurdistan. Why has Prime Minister Abadi not been to see them? Is he not the Prime Minister of those same refugees, those IDPs? Is he not the Prime Minister also of Kurdistan? Don't you think Prime Minister Cameron would rush to see his countrymen if they were flooding into one part of the country as refugees? That tells you a lot about Iraq, doesn't it? Why is it that those refugees, or internally displaced people, wherever they were from in Iraq, they were entitled to rations? Everybody in Iraq is entitled to rations. Why does the Iraqi government not send the rations for those refugees to Kurdistan, so at least they can eat 3 meals a day? Are we not Iraqis? Are they not Iraqis now that they're in Kurdish territory? This is the Iraq that we're talking about today. And the Iraq that we're talking about today, despite billions being spent on its military, gave up Mosul. Mosul, this historic city, this trade center, this city of culture, was given up in 24 hours. What kind of an army is that? You know, I wish I'd bought this book. I saw a book at London City Airport back in July. It's the Economist Book of Data. If you can buy it, please buy it and send me a copy as well. I read it while standing at the airport, and I looked at defense spending around the world. Iraq was top by percentage of GDP. As a percentage of GDP, Iraq spent more than the United States on defense. What happened to all that money? If that's not corruption, I don't know what is. Why is it the Peshmerga, who are today dying, fighting against ISIS, are still not receiving their salary from the central government in Baghdad? What kind of an Iraq are we talking about? So I go back to what I said earlier. The only way that Iraq will survive as a country is if within that same border we have 3 sovereign states who are effectively independent, but if it pleases the world, because it's too much for the world to accept the disintegration of the Sykes-Picot map, then fine, we'll stay within that border, but we will have sovereignty. We will certainly have economic independence in Kurdistan. We haven't had our budget at all this year. We're fighting the most well-armed, richest terrorist organization in the world. We have 1.4 million refugees, and yet Baghdad doesn't release our budget. What kind of an Iraq is that?
It's a good question to end on, but let me ask you one other thing, which is, how much do you consider Turkey in this thinking?
Well, Turkey is a key ally for us. It's currently actually providing a lifeline for us. I've described the financial situation we're facing. Turkey is a key friend in that sense. However, we're all looking at the pictures on television of the Kurds from Kobane in Syria and the battles on the Turkish border. Frankly, I think it's outrageous to see poor, impoverished people treated like that when they're trying to find refuge. So Turkey is a key ally, but there are certain questions, yes.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And then last on the panel, Ali Khaderi. I mean, you'll say what you want, but you've been involved in a big effort. I mean, not the head of that effort, not in charge of that effort, but involved in that big effort by the Americans to create an Iraq that was supposed to be the city on the hill to the rest of the Middle East. What happened?
Well, I have nothing left to say because everybody's already said everything.
That's not true.
Actually, as I was preparing for this event, I was reminded of a plane ride Dr. Allawi and I took a few years ago. We were on a U.S. Air Force jet that is normally Air Force Two, and we were sitting next to each other, and we were debating the situation in the country. And that was in, I believe it was 2006. It was Prime Minister Jafari's visit to the White House. What is remarkable to me, looking back almost a decade later now, is that the situation, frankly, has deteriorated dramatically since those dark days when Iraq was plummeting into civil war. I think I'm correct in saying that I'm the only member of this panel, other than you, that is not an Iraqi citizen. So I look at this from the perspective of an American, former American government official, and really my purpose throughout my time in government, and really even now, is to advance American national security interests. Obviously, our interests for the United States and for Iraq are aligned 99% of the time. We want an Iraq that is stable, that is prosperous, that is democratic, where all citizens are treated as first-class citizens and that are not discriminated against. Unfortunately, though, the simple reality is that for a wide variety of complex reasons under both administrations, this is not an issue of Democrats or Republicans, George W. Bush or Barack Obama, the failure in Iraq transcends both administrations, despite a very hefty price. I lost 4,500 of my countrymen in Iraq, 4,500 military, about 1,600 civilians and contractors. I lost 33,000 wounded in action. You and I will pay taxes from now until the end of time, and then even some, to pay for the $1 trillion war, and that's direct costs, and trillions more in indirect costs. I think there's a simple phenomenon which has marked American policy in Washington for the past decade under, again, both administrations, and that is, unfortunately, a policy of willful delusion and denial when approaching the situation in Iraq. The simple reality is that we went in 2003 based on bad intelligence, and the war was executed very poorly, and there's at least one member of the audience who served with me in Iraq in the embassy, a good friend and colleague, who knows that I was among the most vocal within our system in expressing my unhappiness with our policies for much of the past decade. So the question is, where do we go moving forward? Everybody knows the mistakes that were made under both, again, Bush and Obama. The reality is that the situation has been this cancer of the misrule in Baghdad and in Damascus, supported largely by Iran's Revolutionary Guards. This cancer has metastasized, again, because of this policy of willful delusion and denial under both presidents. I never thought I would see weapons of mass destruction being used on a wholesale level in my lifetime in the 21st century, and that the world would sit back and do nothing. So in Syria, what you've seen over the past 3 years is the Assad government, again supported by Moscow, Tehran, Baghdad, and Lebanese Hezbollah, has used chemical munitions dozens of times, to this day continues using chlorine bombs and barrel bombs, has executed basically a genocide campaign where 200,000 have been killed according to the United Nations, 800,000 more have been wounded, millions more have been displaced, as Bayan touched on, not only in Iraqi Kurdistan. The second largest city in Jordan is a Syrian refugee camp. There's massive contagion issues with Lebanon and now even potentially Turkey and Jordan. So the failure of the international community to act on crises like Syria, the Obama administration's, frankly, I don't even know how to characterize it. The fact that they turned a blind eye to the misrule of Nouri al-Maliki in his second term, when there was no defense minister, when there was no interior minister, when there was no intelligence minister. And as of only a few months ago, the administration was urging Congress to expedite sales of F-16s, Apache attack helicopters, the largest Hellfire cell missile in American history, M1A1 tanks, artillery units, 155 millimeter howitzers, to a government that is clearly helping perpetuate or perpetrate the genocide in Syria, that is clearly aligned with Iran's Revolutionary Guards, is really a very difficult and vexing issue. As Dr. Alawi touched on, and I think I absolutely agree with everything he said, the reality is that there is an inherent contradiction and cognitive dissonance in U.S. foreign policy in regards to both Iraq and the Middle East. So, how do you want to sell F-16s to a government whose transportation minister, as of only a few weeks ago, is a militia commander who's basically, and that militia, the Badr Corps in Hadi al-Amri, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Quds Force. How do you, after only in January declaring, as the President of the United States did, that ISIS is the junior varsity team, now say it's the worst entity basically in the history of humanity? The Secretary of Defense is saying that, Director of the CIA is saying it, the Attorney General is saying it, and the rest of the cabinet. I was on CNN a few weeks ago when the Deputy National Security Advisor of the United States, Tony Blinken, friend and colleague, said that ISIS does not represent a threat to American interests or to the American homeland. Now, the President of the United States is selling air attacks in Syria and Iraq based on the fact that they're essentially an existential threat. So I think moving forward, the thing that I would urge President Obama or Prime Minister Cameron or other leaders, if I had access to them, is to say, simply, please, get real. No more ideologically driven decisions, no more decisions based on domestic polling numbers. Let us identify our real allies in the region. Let us identify, as Dr. Alawi, I think, said, our real foes in the region. And let's develop a comprehensive strategy, because this piecemeal, let's bomb today and figure out what the political strategy is tomorrow, that's exactly what we saw out of Washington and London in 2003. Am I the only one that's seeing eerie parallels? No. That we're bombing and we don't have an answer for the political crises?
Okay, good, thank you. I mean, I've covered enough run-ups to wars and enough wars themselves to see the pattern. I mean, it's not very long ago that Milosevic was the Hitler of the Balkans, but wasn't worth a single American boot on the ground. So here we are again in a different way. You've all been incredibly patient. I think the panel's been great. Shukran akhtir to everybody. Now it's your turn. What I would ask you to do, we have, 20, 25 minutes, is please ask a question, tell us who you are, ask a question. As a reward, there's a reception upstairs afterwards to which you're all invited. But I will try to be fair. I'll take probably three questions at a time. This gentleman has been very persistent with his hand up right in the middle, which makes it hard with the microphone. Thank you. Good.
Thank you.
But again, try to be tight.
Loel Khatib, visiting fellow, Brookings Doha Center. My question is, can Iraq survive if the province of Basra called for a referendum not to declare a separate state, but to ask for equal authority and power to those of the region of Kurdistan? Just to remind quickly the audience, the province of Basra produces over 90% of Iraq's oil. It will continue to that production plateau beyond the increase of over the next few years. And this province received $1 billion budget, houses 3 million people, and received around 10% of last year's Kurdistan's budget. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Gentleman in the front here, and then the lady behind. Thanks. Again, please identify yourself. Thanks.
My name is Kamran Karadagi. I'm a journalist. I worked for 3 years, almost 3 years, from 2005 through 2007 as the Chief of Staff to President Jalal Talabani, and I know how the system and the politicians in Iraq thought and did. And since then, I never thought that Iraq will survive. Now, after all the nice things we heard today about Iraq, I think the simple answer to the question, will Iraq survive, is no. So don't you think it's time, or it's better not to waste time about this, but to try and find an answer to a question, how to divide Iraq peacefully?
Thank you very much. And now, the woman just behind who has her hand up in the brown. Thank you, ma'am.
Hi, thank you. Sundus Abbas, I'm Iraqi Turkmen representative to UK. It's just the guest, they highlighted that the best way is to divide Iraq to Sunni, Shia, Arab. So what about Turkmen, the third largest ethnicity in Iraq? You know, it seems to me everybody forgotten about them, especially now ISIS, what they are doing. They are especially targeting the towns and villages. Most of our towns and villages under the threat of ISIS or under threat of own control of ISIS. We have 500,000 Turkmen displaced from their places. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let's go back to the panel. You don't have to answer everything, but would someone like to respond first?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I think all three questions dealt with the form, the political form in which these various divisions and tensions and conflicts are going to be reflected. And my answer is that they will not be able to resolve these issues in the context of the traditional nation state. It's not possible. The Middle East, and you can't really resolve Iraq's issues outside of the context of the broader Middle East, because other countries in the Middle East are facing the same kind of issues. Syria, certainly, you can question the survival of the state there. Lebanon is on the verge, on the cusp of something dramatic happening there too. So you're talking about a form of government, a form of state formation that has proved uniquely inappropriate for that part of the world. We've had 80 years, nearly 100 years now since World War I, of trying to form some kind of stable political functions whereby a sense of common citizenship is held in the context of a nation state, and it does not work. My conclusion that any division of Iraq or any devolution of powers, whether it's done in Iraq or in Syria and so on, in the context of the nation state structure will not be operative. Now you might say, are you looking at the Khilafah?
Would someone else want to respond? Just because I'd like to get back to questions too, please.
If I may, I agree with Dr. Ali that it's not just Iraq. You can't take Iraq out of the context. And the troubles, whether they be of ISIS, whether they be of mismanagement of corrupt regimes, I mean, we're talking about a catalogue of countries that occupy that particular land. And I think that the question, Mr. Qaradari, that you ask, I think is one that I think we should, as much as I personally hate to pose that question, but I think that we must be realistic at one moment of time and say, well, we need to address that particular question. The issue is, and trying to tie in because I think that the issue of the Turkmen always is sort of sidelined and forgotten, and it's a very valid point. I think that it's virtually impossible to simply slice either Iraq or any other country in the region for that matter, according to very clean and neat either sectarian, ethnic, or racist lines. The problem is, how does this division take place? And what do you do with those who don't don't belong? For instance, what do you do with the Arabs who are born in Kurdistan? What do you do with the Shias who are, part of Nainawa or part of Diyala or Al-Anbar? Or what do you do with the mixed, the hundreds of thousands of mixed marriages? I mean, in my family alone, and I'm an Arab Sunni, in my family alone, we have at least 3 or 4 of my aunts and uncles, Sunnis married to Shias. So what do you do with them? What do you do with their children? Where do they stand? On which side of the border should they be? Or if they happen to be on the wrong side of the border, do they become second-class citizens, seen as migrants and refugees? I mean, so it's a problem that we need. And plus, and this is where I'm going to end, it's the question is not about whether we can divide. I think we can. Whether we can divide peacefully, I think we can. The problem is, shall those new divisions and new smaller entities inherit the same gross mismanagement and corruption of the larger entity, and then we end up with not just one Iraq, that's been grossly mismanaged and riddled with blood and violence, but 10 or maybe even more? That's the question that we need to ask.
Thank you. Abbas, please.
Yeah, briefly, thank you. I think I can say a word about each one. With the Turkmen, not only the Turkmen, what about the Christians? What about the others, the Yazidis and others? I just attended in Washington, D.C. a big gathering for the Christians, the one that took place a few days ago. And it's heartbreaking to hear what is going on there. And I went to college, as I said, in Mosul. And Mosul is, you can't imagine Mosul without the Christians of Mosul. We are the generation that bears this, kind of mark on us that we are the only generation in 2,000 years where Mosul was out of Christians. As far as the Shia in the north, I think the ISIS group took care of that, Dr. Anas.
They solved that problem?
Yeah, they solved it. They killed all of the Shia they could put their hands on, and the others are in Karbala.
Just like the militias did in the south. So it's
yeah,
a problem.
There are differences, and I don't think that there were massacres for the Sunnis, and thank God. But the last thing I want to say for Dr. Staff Qaragdaghi is this question here. It's a very good question. It's not just time that we are wasting. It's blood. It's a lot of other grievances, hopes, and aspirations. So I'm not saying let's break Iraq, but I'm saying let's have a vote now.
Well said. Well,
I did offer a solution. I said 3 sovereign states within one border is a possibility, but of course a completely independent Kurdistan would be much better. In answer to Louay's point about Basra, thank you. That's such a fantastic insight into the situation for the people of Basra. Their right to form a region with others is enshrined in the constitution. The problem is the constitution in Iraq has been ridden roughshod over. If you read the constitution, it's a fantastic document, but nobody abides by it.
And Ali, did you want to say something?
Sure, yeah. Okay. I completely agree with my friend Kamran. The reality is, unfortunately, for those of us who know the Iraqi national leadership, frankly, it's very hard to be optimistic. And there's a very simple reason for that. The combination of poor leadership, lack of vision, the wholesale kleptocracy. There's a simple reality which my friends in Washington don't like to admit, but it's a fact. Every single one of Iraq's political parties, without exception, unfortunately, basically operates on a mafia model. There is the political arm which brings in business. There is a militant arm, a militia, or an armed group that breaks kneecaps when necessary, and then there's a business model. This is the Sopranos sitting on top of $15 trillion of oil and gas reserves, in addition to arable land, ecotourism potential, 2 great rivers, and is in the heart of the Middle East. And so when you have a group of Tony Sopranos running a country in the heart of the Middle East, and because of that misrule, what you will inevitably end up with is militias backed by Iran, or various groups backed by other regional powers, or the disenfranchisement and disillusionment of millions of citizens, Kurdish, Sunni Arab, or Shia Arab alike, and then the rise of groups like ISIS as a direct result of that. Louay brings up a very important point about Basra. The simple reality is, in Washington especially, but also I think perhaps in London or in the West generally, we Americans especially like black, white, Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, etc. And I think many in this room know that it's not that simple. These are not homogeneous groups. And there is a lot of resentment and disenfranchisement and disillusionment, for example, within the Shia community within Iraq. Many people across southern Iraq are extremely unhappy with their government in Baghdad, precisely for the same reason that many Sunni Arabs are, and precisely for the reason that many Kurds are. The government in Baghdad has failed to execute on the very basic social contract, which is provide security, provide services, provide a means of citizens earning a living.
I think at this point no one would disagree with you. Let's try to get another round. Let's start in the back, please. There's a guy, yeah, you, sorry. Please. Wait for the microphone, please, so we can all hear you.
Hello.
Thanks.
My name's Aziz Rashid. I don't know how to describe myself apart from a well-connected Kurd. I'd like to know, I mean, firstly, I can't believe I'm going to do this, but as a Kurd, I think I'm going to be on the side of Baghdad a little bit, because I think all the groups, all their failings are self-conflicted. Whether it's Kurdistan, whether it's Shias, whether it's Sunnis, because everyone sees Baghdad as having one foot in, one foot out. The number one disappointment I have is with our own president. I mean, he sold a dream of independence when push came to shove. His, it was all seen through. We're not ready for independence. He promised that to our people. There's nothing really stopping us. In our history, we've had, it's probably been the best time to declare independence. We had public support, probably in Iraq and outside. Could you turn it into a question, or try to? So my question is it really Baghdad's fault, or is it the different groupings' fault? Because if it's a different grouping's fault, there is no hope for Iraq.
Okay, thank you. Else in the back, this gentleman right next to you, thanks.
Yeah. I would like to ask Dr.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Mihyar from SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies. I'd like to ask Dr. Abbas, will the people of Iraq, and particularly the Arabs, whether they're Sunni or Shia, and these are primordial terms we use, unfortunately, will they ever relinquish rights and claims to Kirkuk?
Okay, and let's go over the gentleman, and actually, madam, you please, thanks.
I'd like to know.
Please
I beg your pardon.
Yourself,
I'm Elizabeth Palmer. I'm a reporter for CBS News. I'd like to know what you think the United States' role is in the next chapter of Iraq, and also whether you think that the bombings at the moment against ISIS are justified as a tactical move in order to, if maybe just buy some breathing room.
And then the man behind you with the eyeglasses. I think given the time, what I'm going to do is take a bunch of questions and then go back to the panel and at the end. Okay, well, so please, sir.
I just think
please identify yourself.
Yusuf Al-Khoui from Al-Khoui Foundation. I think there is a lot of misinformation about, and I think we are not really dealing with the crux of the problem. The crux of the problem is there is an ideology which believes in beheading people, which believes in destroying places of worship, which believes in destroying anybody which is against them. And unfortunately, this ideology has been supplied with information, with publicity, with money, with oil, through Gulf states who are very Western friendly. And it is ironic that these same countries want to fight ISIS, because as Dr. Abbas said, they come from the same ideology. I think unless the West deals with this menace, which is coming from friends such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia, we are just beating around the bush. You can blame Maliki as much as you like. As a matter of fact, the misinformation is there are currently less Sunni ministers in Abadi's government than they were in Maliki. Yet the rest of the world thinks that this is a more inclusive government. There is hardly a minister.
I think the point's clear. Thanks. Thanks very, very much. If we could come down here, this gentleman's been very, very patient. Thanks. And then the man next to you.
Samir Girsel, member of Chatham House. In 2003, we invaded Iraq to bring them democracy and get the weapon of mass destruction out of the country, which never existed. Now, some time later, like now, the parliament is going to get a vote of confidence to attack Iraq again, this time for ISIS. In 2003, when Americans destroyed the country, literally took it to the Stone Age, killing hundreds of thousands of people by different weapons. And when they left it to the Al-Qaeda, which is a creation which we all know. After that, Al-Qaeda went underground, came out with different identity. Now we're giving the excuse to the ISIS, who are the creation of some countries which we all know as well. There is no need to name them. Now we're given another excuse to go back to Iran to destroy it further from 2003. Is that justified under human rights?
Okay, fine. You've asked the question. The gentleman next to you. Thank you.
My name is Nisar Ali Shah. I'm a journalist by profession. Strange alliances are happening in the Middle East now. David Cameron in New York was begging Rouhani, the president of Iran, to side with him. Obama is fishing in the political corridor in Syria to be on the American side. Now, earlier we heard that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain was helping IS. Now we hear that they are aligned with the Americans. Now the American and the Western countries' interpretation of Islam is very dodgy. They don't understand Islam, and also they don't understand terrorism. So I think what the Americans and the British are going to do to airstrike in Iraq or in Syria, they are afraid of Syria as well because they don't want any foot soldiers there or in Iraq. But the point actually I'm making is that what are they going to achieve? Killing for sake of killings is no achievement.
Thank you.
So that's my question to the panelists.
Could you now give the microphone to this gentleman? Thank you.
John Wilson, a member of Chatham House and a journalist. Mine is a quick question. Where does the panel predict that Iraq will be in 10 years' time?
Okay. That's a good one. Now, I'm going to take, unfortunately, I have to take two more questions. There is a woman in the back. If you could just, yes, you, again, please identify yourself.
My name's Abby Fielding-Smith. I'm from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. I've got a question actually for Bayan Sami Abdurrahman. You mentioned the sort of catastrophic collapse of the Iraqi army at Mosul. But there's also been a lot of criticism of the collapse of Kurdish forces and the failure to protect the Yazidi minority in Sinjar. And I just wondered if you had a sort of comment on the sort of criticism that they didn't do enough to protect the Yazidis.
Good, thank you. And then just, I apologize, but one more. The gentleman in the beard in the middle.
Yeah, my name's Court Robinson, and I'm a friend of the panel members. My question is this. Are you not, the six of you, sitting there being utterly presumptuous by expecting the British people, the average man in the street, not including the so-called good and great of Britain, who sit in the Westminster Parliament just down the road, why should they support this narrative when it's going to cost money, when the money could be used for the indigenous Britons? You talked about not so long ago in the speeches from the individual members about Scotland. And what's very interesting about the Scotland thing was the Glaswegian working class indigenous people of Scotland, who haven't got, if I may say so, I have to advance you on my swear word, which is they haven't got a pistol potted. So do you think, therefore, the money should be better spent on them as opposed to your endeavours? I mean, you're a hopeless case, really, aren't you?
I probably am. Yes, thank you. Now, we actually don't have that much time. So what I'm going to ask is to come back to the panel. We'll go back in reverse order. So, I mean, that should be clear. Try to limit yourself to 2 minutes. Answer what you feel like answering. Don't try to answer everything. And please, Ali, go ahead.
I'd like to touch on the question of the United States' role for obvious reasons. One of the things that I'm so extremely concerned about is the fact that, again, the President of the United States only a few weeks ago, or certainly a couple of months ago, was saying that ISIS is not a threat, and now is, his cabinet member's hair is on fire, and he's essentially taking the country to war. Whether he admits it or not, we are at war with an enemy who has declared war on us. Whether we admit it or not, we do have boots on the ground. They may not be a combat role, but I think it gravely dishonors them, the 2,000 service members, the thousands of American diplomats, the thousands of contractors who are on the ground, to say that there are no boots on the ground. The issue that I find to be so concerning is that we've initiated this bombing campaign that is obviously going to degrade ISIS, but it certainly, absolutely will not destroy ISIS, as the President of the United States has outlined. I mean, it is physically impossible, because they will do exactly what Al-Qaeda in Iraq did post-2003. They will melt into the civilian populations in Iraq and in Syria, and without primarily the Sunni Arabs in both countries battling them, because the Peshmerga can't do it, the Shia Islamist militias or the Iraqi security forces can't do it. It has to be the indigenous populations of these provinces that have been invaded by ISIS. They are the only ones that can defeat them, as we saw with the awakening in 2006 and 7 and 8 during the surge. So again, what is so concerning is that Washington, London, and other global capitals are going to war, beginning dropping bombs, and they don't seem to have a coherent strategy for what comes the day after. I think I'll just leave it at that and pass it to Bayan.
Thank you. I'll touch on a couple of questions that were specific to, or points that were specific to the Kurds. Kak Asos said you were disappointed that the carrot of independence was dangled and then taken away, but we haven't finished with that issue yet. The Kurdistan Parliament is currently looking into establishing an electoral commission to carry out a referendum on independence. So we're still on track with that. It's just that the priority is to deal with the house being on fire. So don't lose hope. The question on protection of the Yazidis, I agree with you that that was a failure. I'm from Sinjar myself, where most of the Yazidis are. I'm not Yazidi though. But being a Sinjari or a Shingali, of course, a lot of my friends, colleagues are from there, and I was in touch with them before and after. So yes, mistakes were made, failures have been exposed. But if I can just put it in context for you, overnight after Mosul fell, the Kurdistan region, or the Peshmerga I should say, found themselves protecting a 1,000-kilometer border with ISIS. That border previously had been protected by the Iraqi army, the Peshmerga, and in the old days, partly also by the Americans. The Americans were no longer there. The Iraqi army disintegrated. It was left just to the Peshmerga. It's a very long stretch of border to protect. The other issue, which is still very current today, the Peshmerga are not well armed. Our arms are old. They tend to be from East Europe or Soviet era. Some, I've been told, are even from the Iran-Iraq war or pre-2003. And ISIS have captured the latest American weaponry, so we were literally outgunned in many areas. But I agree with you, the Yazidis suffered enormously, and there were failures on our part. One last point, the lady asked about the next chapter for US policy in Iraq, and the gentleman at the front, I think, asked what would Iraq look like in 10 years' time. I think the West and the Middle East needs to have a holistic approach. We need to think about the crisis in political terms, humanitarian terms, military terms, and there needs to be a new settlement for Iraq and possibly for the Middle East. Thank you.
Anas.
Very quick points. First of all, to the gentleman at the back, one thing that we have learned from ISIS is that forming a state isn't that difficult at all. In fact, it was Alex Salmond just a few days ago who said, by the way, we don't really need a referendum to form our own state. So, you know, go ahead. You know, I think if I was to advise the Kurds, I say, listen, declare your state, declare independence, set up checkpoints. Most of them are already there. Do it. But guess what? Your problem won't be with the Iraqis. Your problem will be with the international community. Your problem will be with Iran, with Turkey, and any kind of semblance of Syria that comes after this mess that it's in. So that's the problem that you need to address. The gentleman here about 2003, I'm like you. I mean, today I made a post on Twitter saying, how many times does Iraq need to be liberated? How many times do we need to be democratized? I don't know a nation that needs to be democratized as many times as the Iraqis. It's just ludicrous. But unfortunately, It's using the same old tactics again and again, expecting different outcomes. It's not going to work. 10 years? 10 years is a huge amount of time. I mean, ask me what's going to happen next year, this time next year, and I'm going to say that things aren't going to be how they look today. But it's not just going to be Iraq. It's going to be the entire region. Pay attention to what's happening south of Saudi Arabia in Yemen and the transformation that's happening there. The Gulf states won't be the way they look right now. North Africa, we're looking at a region, if you like, in the making for a new phase. Whether that phase is going to be better or not, that's the question we need to deal with. Change isn't good for change itself, just to leave a bad situation, because often when we try to change a bad situation, we ended up with something far worse. How can we avoid doing that once again? Yes, very quickly. Regarding Sheikh Yusuf, the like of ISIS do not represent anyone. I'm the most vocal critic of the Saudi regime and others. But ISIS are an anomaly. The fact is, we need to ask, how is it that these ideologies take grip of a land? What you need for these ideologies, such anomalies, such extraordinary, really strange phenomena, to take grip is a sufficiently disenfranchised, alienated environment. That's what they found in Iraq. That's where the responsibility of the central government lies.
Thank you. Abbas.
Thank you. Since a couple of questions were posed to me, then I will probably answer them. But since your question was very quick, what happens with Iraq in 10 years? My answer to that is I do everything in the political analysis through my hat as a historian, and I don't deal with the future. I only deal with the past, so I cannot tell you what happens. The question about Kirkuk, good question. I think it's going to be more a battle between the KRG and its neighbor, that if anything that happens, would be the Sunni Arab entity that will happen, whether it's a region within Iraq or it's an independent state. The Shia are far away from it. They have more oil than they can spend the money for. But the big question is that if there is any kind of settlement for Kirkuk, if it's within an independence, then Dr. Anas is right. You have to deal with the international community. After all, you have to go to the UN. And no separation case happened before without a good working agreement with the center, in other words, internal agreement on where the borders will be, and then the ratification and vote of confidence of the international community ultimately in the UN. So they have to work Kirkuk before they talk about independence. Otherwise, Kirkuk will be in limbo. Sayyid Yusuf, good to see you again. It's Saudi. Yes, this is the big problem. Saudi and the Gulf states, they are the sacred cow in Washington, D.C. We just had a panel the other day on Gulf connection to supporting and financing terrorism. We went from one think tank to another, literally every door. No one wanted to do it. Finally, we had to rent a place in Carnegie, for that matter, which refused to host it. But when we paid for them, they said, you get the hall and you do whatever you want with it. So there is no way. And the reason, there was an article in the New York Times the other day, follow the money, see which think tanks get Saudi money and why they are answering. And I can name a few, Council on Foreign Relations, this or that. Okay. But, no, this is public record. I mean, look, it's really, you get there. Now, let's go to the last thing here, but it's an excellent question. If I may be allowed to go back to Luay's question, and I think it's an excellent question. Basra has gotten not just the short end of the stick, it got nothing of the stick so far, not even a project to desalinate the water. Their children are dying because of bad water, and Basra has not gotten that. To the gentleman who talked about British money, this is an excellent question. I think, I wrote a book. Now I only have the Arabic version. I don't want to walk around in London with the English one. About the 1920 revolution and what the British did in 1920. I don't want to see the government of Britain again in Iraq doing anything. But I think if you want to do something as a British government, as a British populace, with acknowledging that every penny should be spent here, is talk to them about whether ISIS is a threat to Britain, whether their recruitment of British kids concerns someone. If you find that it is not concerning, I think you should not be there.
Okay, thank you. Ali.
Generals, they always say, fight the last war. And we seem to be fighting also the last war here. Obviously, the main issues in the Middle East are couched in ethno-sectarian terms, and Said Yusuf is absolutely right. There was a piece in the New York Times 2 days ago which made it clear the links between the Wahhabi ideology and what ISIS is doing. They're, in fact, handing out textbooks issued by the Saudi Ministry of Education to school pupils in Raqqa and Mosul, which shows you the depth, the nefarious depth of this ideology and spread throughout unfortunately, the Sunni Arab world. One of the tendencies that has happened in the last few years is the extreme radicalization of Sunni thought towards Wahhabism, leaving out the huge, moderate, and historically traditional way of engaging with other sects and other communities, which marked historical Sunni Islam. This is really a major issue. The other issue, which I think is also looming up, which we haven't yet paid any attention to, is that there is a very serious socio-economic crisis in the Middle East. We have massive unemployment, there's huge inequalities, there's environmental degradation, and it's affecting the majority population of the Middle East, which are Sunni Arabs. There is this other element of the crisis, which is going to come up soon, and it's going to hit the people in the Gulf before it's going to hit anybody else, which is the huge, the sense of oppression being felt by a very, very large number of Sunni Arabs throughout the area. It has been channeled in the past into a very virulent form of anti-Shiism, at least at the margin. Now it's going to take, it may take a class form, in which case people in these countries, the so-called Sunni leadership in the Middle East, had better wake up that this is going to be even more problematic and is going to lap, I'm afraid, at the shores of those countries that think of themselves as being somehow beyond the crises of the area,
well,
which are the Gulf countries.
On that happy note, I do want to thank all of you. I do want to say, come upstairs, ask the panel the questions you were not able to ask tonight, but please join me in thanking them with a round of applause. Thank you.